mean, I've been officially old for a while, but, makes you feel even older at a certain point, right?
I feel and look old.
Yeah.
And I feel it even more when I try to use Instagram Live. Thanks for doing this today.
No, thanks for having me.
If for those of you who are just tuning in, I think this is the first Mission Wine and Spirits Live Instagram ever, and simultaneously my first ever, unless you count the ones where I was an importer, doing it with another retailer like myself now. We've got Phil today from Maker's Mark. We decided to have a conversation about not just Maker's Mark, but wheated bourbon in general, because it's two things that we're both passionate about. And I feel like there's a lot of talk about how awesome wheated bourbon is without really much information behind it or knowledge about, really what it is or what the other offerings are in the market besides Pappy Van Winkle. So I thought I would start by asking you, what do you tell people when you talk about Maker's Mark and they ask you questions about wheated bourbon? Because I always think of Maker's Mark as like the original, even though there are older ones,
Maker's, everything we did was for a very specific reason. Oh, sorry. I think there was a lapse there.
Yeah, let's do that again. Let's start over one more time.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I think I'm ready.
Okay. Take 3. All right, so let's talk about Maker's Mark and the history of wheated bourbon and Bill Samuels and all that. Give me your 5-minute intro when you talk about Maker's Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Bill Samuels Sr., when he created Maker's Mark, he came from a whiskey making family. They owned the T.W. Samuels distillery. I mean, Bill Samuels was a T.W. Samuels. That was his name, right? T. William Samuels, but he went by Bill. He didn't like his family's whiskey all that much, and they made a traditional rye bourbon, right? Like mostly corn, a little bit of rye, just a touch of malt, right? That was typical bourbon mash bill is what they made, and he just wasn't to his liking. And so, sold the distillery, sold the brand, tried his hand at other things, but was one of those guys, a tinkerer, so to speak, right? And he was always like, hey, if I was going to go back and make bourbon, here's what I'd do. And my wife, Margie, was like, well, you need to just shut up and go do it. Stop talking about it. So he said, fine, I'm going to go back, but I'm going to make the whiskey I want to drink. So I'm going to make something a little more, we don't love to use the term sweet because sweet is not necessarily like a specific flavor, but more kind of front palate, tip of the tongue, creamy texture, big body, but still kind of easy to drink and approachable, right? And that was his big goal. And we love to tell stories about like how he and Margie baked bread at home to figure out that wheat was the right ingredient to use. And they're amazing stories, and they happened. But let's also think about it like he came from a whiskey-making family. He lived in Kentucky. He lived next door to the nose and the beans. Like he knew these folks. He was all his contemporaries, all his friends also made bourbon whiskey. So I'm sure that sitting around having a drink with Pappy Van Winkle or with the Shapiras or with the Nose or with Jimmy Russell or something, these were all friends. These were all buddies, and they still are. Those of them who are still with us, and just said like, hey, this is the flavor I'm going for, and they all said like, maybe you should do wheat, right? Like I'm sure this wasn't just the bread experiment, which is super cool and an amazing story. But these are all experts, and some of them were already using wheat, not all of them, only a few. But I think that's really how we got into the wheated bourbon game. I think if you go back even further, wheated bourbon is such like it's got a bit of a disputed history, so to speak.
Right.
And I kind of love that aspect of bourbon, where so many of the stories are based on like what was available, right? Like bourbon's corn, because that's what you grew in Kentucky to get your land, right? Wheat, the small grains or the secondary grains were kind of what was on hand, right? So I read something in kind of getting ready today is Michael Veach was saying that like he found records of Henry McKenna.
Right. I read the same thing. Did you found the old Chuck Cowdery Michael Veach conversation? Yeah. Look, I thought about calling Chuck up, but I haven't talked to him in like 5 years, and I thought that would be weird and be like, hey, I haven't talked to you to even say hello, but I need your help.
One of my first one of my trips to Makers to pick out a barrel, private select, rented an Airbnb in Louisville, and we were up a little late partying, because we were a bunch of bartenders in town from Chicago at the time, and we were all hanging out. And the next morning, we walk out, and the neighbors were like, "Hey, we get it. You're in Kentucky. Maybe just take it inside tonight." We were like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." We got to talking, and we were renting the house next door to Michael Beach.
Oh, no way! What a trip!
Yeah. So
for those of you that are watching,
he was like, "Yeah, I get it. You're in Kentucky. You're here to enjoy some bourbon, but maybe just take it inside because we were in the backyard with the campfire going."
Michael Veach, for those of you, hold on, I'm just going to interrupt you real fast, Phil. For those of you watching, Michael Veach is a bourbon historian, so Phil and I were both perusing the same notes to figure out, where wheated bourbon comes from, and basically there's no real record. There are records of people who may have been making it, but then people think it may have been wheat whiskey, not necessarily wheated bourbon, and then it may not have been a recipe or any real plan as much as it was just, I had some wheat and I had some corn, and
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the beauty of American whiskey in a lot of ways. Like a lot of the innovation in American whiskey seems to be like bred out of necessity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this is what was on hand. This is where we were living. This grows where we live. This is what works. And I think that is one of the things I love about American whiskey as a category, bourbon specifically, is how much of that comes from just, the land around them, right? Like it's that true pioneer lifestyle, right? You bring what you know with you, the skills, but you use those skills around whatever resources you had on hand. And I think that's pretty interesting. Our wheat at Maker's Mark, comes from 9 miles from the distillery, right? When I first started with Maker's, I got lost on my way home back to the hotel once during training, and I just ended up on Peterson Farm, right there. There's a sign. That's our wheat suppliers, the Petersons.
Wow.
Have been since we opened. So in that little valley of Loretto, Kentucky, or there, where the lake sits, where Maker's Mark is, wheat grows really prevalent, right? Like right there in Loretto. I don't know enough about the story, but the Sisters of Loretto, the convent, were cultivating these specific wheat varietals, right? Peterson Farm sells it commercially, and it's Bill knew what he wanted flavor-wise, but he also picked a location for his new distillery that helped him build that flavor, right?
Right.
Amazing water source, but also he's right there. The wheat's 10 miles down the road, right? And we've been buying it from the same family since the day we opened.
What's really amazing about Maker's Mark, I have a friend that moved to Kentucky. This noise that you hear bouncing around is 2 cats that are attacking each other right by my feet. But
I just heard my 8-month-old puppies on the other side of the door. I was like, oh my God. So,
they're probably going to knock over the phone at some point, and then I'll have to pick it up. But that being said, I have these 2 cats, and the vet that that initially treated the cats and helped me adopt them moved to Kentucky. And so a few weeks ago, she had a friend in town, and she said, can you set me up with a tour at Buffalo Trace? Because my friend's a big Pappy fan, and he wants to go see it and blah, blah, blah. And I said, I will, but you should really go to Maker's Mark. If you want to go somewhere that's beautiful, I mean, I understand that Maker's Mark doesn't have the lore right now in our cult pop culture bourbon whiskey world right now that the Van Winkles do, but the tour is so much better and the estate is so much more beautiful, and I feel like people are sort of let down after that tour just because Buffalo Trace is not really all that beautiful. It's a great distillery that makes great whiskey, but it's not necessarily the most visually beautiful thing, whereas Maker's Mark is whiskey Disneyland, and it's this rolling hills and old buildings, and it smells delicious. It smells like sweet mash, and I just can't imagine anywhere more beautiful. So they ended up going there, and they ended up going to both, and they agreed that at the end they were more sort of won over by Maker's Mark. I guess the whole point of this rambling story is that if you could get more people to go to Maker's Mark, I feel like there would be more Maker's Mark fans, because of how important that experience is. And when I'm drinking Maker's Mark right now, and I smell this and I sip it, and it brings me back to that visual, and those things will be linked for the rest of my life.
And we have Margie to thank for that. So we talked about Bill. Bill's wife Margie was a crucial part of our founding. She designed this bottle, her handwriting, the iconic red wax. But I think something she did that she gets the credit for, especially as part of why she's in the Bourbon Hall of Fame, is one is maintain that property, right? It's Bill was an engineer. He went in and he's like, let's level this and build a modern facility. And she's like, whoa. look at this. This is gorgeous Victorian era construction. Let's maintain it. Let's restore it. It's a National Historic Landmark. But she also invited folks to come look around. I think prior to that, like the idea of like going to a distillery or a brewery or a winery wasn't necessarily this like tourist destination. But she just said like, hey, how do we get more people to drink it? Well, let's like invite them to this beautiful space. Let them walk around. Let them see how we make it. And it just changes everything. Like you said, all of a sudden that glass becomes a time machine back to when you were at Makers, right?
Right.
That glass machine. She knew that. She knew they had something special in that space, and it was a huge point of hers to make sure folks knew they could come. She put the invitation right on the side of the bottle. Come to our distillery. Walk around. We'll show you around. And we still we depend and love hosting visitors and are doing everything we can to make that the best experience possible. When was the last time you were out there?
2018 probably. I went to Maker's Mark. I mean, Maker's Mark. I've always been treated really well by everybody. I'm sort of a relationship person where, I mean, I like things, personally, but like if I have a bad experience at a distillery, that will ruin that whiskey for me. And so I'm always very hypersensitive to the way that like I deal with customers in retail, because I know how inextricably linked customer service and friendliness and attitude and all that stuff is to my experience of that product.
When you think about it, it's hospitality from the top.
Exactly.
Everything we're doing, when we make this, we're making it to be shared, right? When you're selling it to someone to take and share, right? Like it's all about that. Whiskey, wine, beer, whatever it may be, is meant to be shared with other folks, and so like you've got to take that same ethos throughout everything you do. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to work for Makers. So I was on the bar side for a long time. Went to Makers a few times. Like I said, at that time I was based out of Chicago, and the way they treated me and my team and the welcoming nature of it, I kind of hounded them until they gave me a job. It was like, no, I want to work for this brand. It's not that I want a brand job. It's that I want to work for Makers. I want to work for the Samuels family. I want to work for the team in Loretto, and so, they probably have regretted it every day since, but that was definitely, it was the love of the brand and the love of the place came first. And then I worked to try to get this job.
So here's the question. I love Maker's Mark. I remember one of my favorite memories was going to tequila with my friend Lou Palatella, a big Southern guy here in California, like Southern Wine and Spirits, who launched his own tequila company. And we're in fucking Guadalajara on a tequila trip to promote and drink tequila. And the guy orders Maker's Mark at the bar. And I just looked at him. I was like, are you kidding me right now? It's like, we're in Mexico to support your tequila, and you want to order Maker's Mark? And he's like, I order Maker's Mark no matter where I am, wherever I go. The whole point of that is within these old timers in the industry, Maker's Mark is their brand. It's like that was the thing when they were cutting their teeth in the industry and with whiskey. And so they have a loyalty to it that will last them for the rest of their lives. My question to you right now is, do you think Maker's Mark is so endearing because it's a wheated bourbon and it has a really great flavor? Or is it because that it's a wheated bourbon that people like it now?
Yeah, the classic chicken versus egg.
The chicken and egg question, exactly.
Right? This is one. I think everything that drives us is flavor driven, right? Like everything we do. We joke we have 200 full-time employees whose job is to make our whiskey taste the way one guy liked it to taste in the 50s, right? Like that's everything we do. So I'd love to sit here and say that, like, yes, people drink Makers because of the way it tastes. And I think that is true most of the time. But I do think there are those people who, for one reason or another, love a different brand, but maybe they can't get it. Maybe it's highly allocated. It's on secondary, this, that, the other, and they just want something in that kind of wheated wheelhouse. Yeah, of course we're going to benefit from that. But I think you brought up something a little earlier, is that, like, old-timers who are going back to Makers because it's the thing that made them fall in love with it, even those folks I meet who are like collectors with ridiculous collections, bottles worth thousands of dollars, like amazing stuff, when I get to talking to folks like that, they're always like, well, the bourbon that got me into bourbon was Maker's Mark.
Right.
And I think that there's a familiarity to it that actually probably carries over maybe even to other wheated bourbons in the category of that, like, tip of the tongue,
right,
creamy texture, kind of signature quality that familiarity, like you talked about, that sense memory when you take that sip, that's really comforting. Right?
Why do you want to avoid the word sweet though? Like, is it like a company thing where we don't want to say the whiskey's sweet?
No. I don't think it's a company thing. It's not. I think the industry as a whole seems to have like not too sweet has replaced like everything. People avoid the word sweet because I think it implies sugar, right?
Yeah. Well, no, of course.
Like,
it's the same with wine. Yeah, like no one wants to say their Riesling sweet. They want to say it's fruity or, like expressive.
It's more to we can get to like what do we mean by sweet, and I think like, hey, let's talk about just some of the tasting notes that are found in makers, but also other weedy bourbons: vanilla, caramel, toffee, honey. Right? Those are all things that are
sweet. Right?
Like, it's not that we're necessarily avoiding it. It's just it's kind of we want to be a little more specific, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Right? That's always the funny thing to me is that like people look at sweet things as not necessarily as like the opposite of connoisseurship, because like babies like sweet things. People that don't know anything about food like things sweet. So it's seen as like a derogatory in terms of expertise. If you like something that's sweet, it means that your palate isn't as evolved as somebody who can, like a dry white wine or a dry martini. It's like people get all nervous in the bars, like something dry, please, just anything dry, because they don't want to appear like a novice, right?
I'll admit I have the biggest sweet tooth on earth, like right, like I am drawn to sweet flavors, period, across the board, and so I think my dentist hates it, my acid reflux hates it, all those things. But it is definitely, again, like I said, I was drawn to the brand and I'm drawn to the category because I have a sweet tooth. Like it's, I don't purposely try to avoid it. I just try to find better ways to describe it that aren't gonna like. Because I feel like sometimes the minute you say sweet to somebody, especially in California for some reason, because everybody avoids sugar,
right?
It's
for like, health reasons.
The minute you say sweet, they've glossed over to something else. So like, all right, how can I explain sweet without saying sweet?
That's always I always felt like saying sweet wheat was, like a really easy moniker to be able to like describe the whiskey. It's like it's super sweet. It's like, how come people like Pappy and how come it's so good? I was like, because it's fucking sweet. It's like concentrated sugar juice in a barrel. Yeah. And it's the sweetest possible bourbon there is. It's like it's like molasses and like honey and pure sugar. And then, you have something that has a rye, like a high rye spice in it. It's funny. Do you feel like rye whiskey has become less popular ever since like there was the initial boom when like pre-prohibition cocktails came back like 2008-ish, 2009-ish? It was all about rye because rye was underproduced, and then all the rye went out, and then we have the MGP wave, and that whole evolution. But I feel like rye is just sort of like dead now. Like nobody cares about rye anymore. It's all about bourbon, and to me, that speaks to like the whole sweet tooth philosophy. The idea that like bourbon is still really big because it's the sweetest possible whiskey there is. Like if you think, I mean, I'm not trying to like rip on bourbon fans. I love bourbon. I'm drinking it right now, but it's the easiest possible whiskey to appreciate because it's the sweetest possible whiskey there is.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, right?
There isn't, as long as we can just admit it and be open about it.
And all that. So like, totally agree. I don't know that I've seen evidence of like a rye slowdown yet. Brands are still launching new ryes, so I'm wondering if we're going to start seeing more older ryes. If we do see that slowdown, like Bullet, I think, just came out with like a 12-year-old 95% rye, which is like, man, they were selling so much rye. I'm surprised that something got that old, right? Like,
right.
But I think people are like Rare Breed rye just came out, right? From
right.
Turkey. So like clearly there's a demand there because brands are still looking to like launch new ryes and get people excited. I will say one of the number one questions we get when we talk about makers is like, when's Makers going to come out with a rye? And I was like, don't hold your breath, my friend.
Right. Well, I mean, when did Makers 46 launch? Was that like 2011? It took like
2010,
2010. So what, 60 years roughly with one expression?
Yeah, exactly. And that expression is meant to kind of prove the fact that, like, all right, when you say you want rye, I think what you mean is you want intensity and you want a little bit of spice. We can create that in a wheated bourbon with 46, right? Like, we can give you some of that flavor-wise, but we still are going to sit in the tip of your tongue. We're going to be sweet. Like, 46 has such a sweet start. Like, it just hits you like a liquid caramel. Then all the spice comes and this layered finish. And it's like, yeah, we did that with a wheated bourbon, right? Like to produce a rye, which I tell people not to hold their breath.
Where do you think Maker sits on like the spectrum of wheated bourbons? Like if you had to, let's take like Larceny, Willet, Pot Still, Weller, Pappy, all the wheated bourbons that we know of on the market. Where do you think it sits on the sweetness spectrum and on the flavor spectrum?
I think probably one of the I'm gonna actually don't tell anybody sip a competitor just for this conversation.
Connor O'Driscoll, he already texted me today. He's like, "Why are you doing an Instagram with anybody that's not Larceny?"
Perfect. Well, hey, Danny Potter's making Maker's Mark again, so it all comes
back around, doesn't it?
Yeah. But I think for me, the biggest thing I noticed in a difference is I think they all have that sweetness, but the biggest thing is I think Maker's texture is completely different, and I think there's a few reasons for that. Like we don't chill filter anything, so that we do carbon treat the 90 proof classic Makers, but there's no chill filtration on our side at all. So obviously that's going to impact texture. We actually have a relatively high malt percentage, right? So we have 14% barley malt in our mash,
right?
Which is
That's high,
pretty high for most bourbons, and so I think there's a textural difference that's immediately noticeable. And so I did today had my wife actually pour me some blinds of Larceny versus Makers, and just wanted to see like, hey, is this all in my head? Is this buying into my own like brand story, or is this real? And I was able to identify them purely based on texture. But when it comes to like that initial palate sensation, I think they're very similar. I think the nose is really different. There's something about the nose. Like you mentioned, the minute you smell Makers, you smell cooking grains, right? Like you smell the way the distillery smells when you walk around, right? Like sweet, almost like caramel popcorn, right? There's something there that's really lovely, that tastes, that smells like the place. I get almost like a spicy, junipery, something different with Larceny, for example, just because it's what I have in front of me. And again, it's not good or bad; it's just different, right? And everybody's going for something different. But I think Makers is, for me, one of the bigger body whiskeys out there for its age, right? When we get into the older expressions, the older Pappies, things like that, obviously texture is going to change with those, with that the length of oak it sees. But for the relative age statement of, say, like Larceny versus Makers versus Weller in that like 6 to 7 year range, I think it's got really, really unctuous, creamy, big texture.
What do you feel about wheated bourbons being put into barrel at a lower proof? It feels like everything I've read seems like people just do that because that's just what they were told to do. And I heard that like Larceny doesn't do that, so that would be the difference between Larceny and Maker's Mark, right?
That's something I found today too. Just like looking around, is I found an article where Harlan Wheatley talked about going into the barrel at 114 for Weller and Pappy, and I know we go into the barrel at 110. It's actually funny. I was having a conversation with Bruce Russell from Wild Turkey last week. We just happened to be doing some kind of like cross-training category, kind of just like, hey, let's get together. And
not like cross-training, not like where you guys are like running and then doing push-ups and then skiing and then biking.
No, I've got the quarantine 15 hard. No, definitely not that. But no, we were just talking, and he actually asked me that question. And Turkey has a pretty low entry proof as well. They're at 115. Like
they have the lowest. I feel like I always remember that being like their thing for all their bourbons, not just wheated.
Like we go in at 110, 115 for them. 140. Beam changes depending on which product they're producing. They have different entry proofs, so it all that is a huge part of the flavor. But he brought up like how tricky rye can be to work with, right? And how wheat is a much more efficient grain throughout cooking, fermentation, distillation, right? Your chances of like foaming or boil over are lower.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily stick to the
right. It's not as like grimy or gristy. It's easier to work with.
I think it seems to be that you don't have to worry about some of the other issues that a rye might produce. Rye's got that higher protein content. It's just different. So where with wheat, you can focus on the starch. You can kind of really have a nice clean fermentation and clean distillation, so you can continue to do those things at a lower proof, because the grain itself, the biology of the grain itself, is going to give you that clean distillate, right? That nice efficient fermentation. Like all those things are going to kind of like go hand in hand. So yeah, I think that was something new I learned over the past week. When Bruce brought it up last week, I was like, that's a really interesting question that I haven't dug into, and so I started asking around a little bit and digging into it. I love seeing a quote from somebody else making wheated bourbon and putting it in entry proof at a lower entry proof. It was like, oh, cool, okay, yeah, this all kind of makes sense now.
Right.
But
you feel like you like.
Think about the chemistry of the wheat distillate versus in the oak and how they interact with each other too.
Right.
Again, I'm not a biochemist. I don't have that kind of chemistry language in my head. But from what I understand, is like they play well together, right? Like that wheated bourbon, that American oak, the chemistry just works in a way where you can get away with that lower entry proof.
I feel like that lower entry proof though has as much to do with them wanting wheated whiskeys to be more mellow and creamy and soft as it does to maybe something to do with extraction of oak. Like. Yeah. From what I saw as to like why certain or from what I read and from what I've been told, the reason that they fill wheated bourbons in at lower proofs is because that's what they were told to do, because that's what the guy before them told them to do. So maybe there is something to it in terms of science, but I also feel like it's also to make them softer and creamier and easier to sip, and that's why people like them.
Well, between me and you, we'll keep this very private. I did taste the series of experiments at Maker's Mark, where we actually tried different entry proofs. Let's see if we're right? Like, let's see if our own talking points actually hold up. Where it's like, you're absolutely right. Everybody was doing 110, 115-ish 50 years ago, 60 years ago. That was the industry kind of standard. And people realized, like, oh, we can creep up. By law, we can go up. And there's numbers. We as a brand could save millions of dollars if we increased our barrel entry proof. But we did the experiment. We lined them up and we put some barrels down and we said, all right, here's some at our normal 110. Let's put one in at 115. Let's put one in at 120. Let's put one in at 125. And let's line them up and let's put them in let's control as many other variables as we can. And then in 6 years, let's pull them out and taste them and see if it has as big of an impact as we think it does. And it absolutely did. They are night and day different whiskeys. Right?
Wow. When did you guys do that? When did that happen?
It happened about 6 years ago.
Oh, okay. Wow.
I tasted those samples right before all the shutdown and stuff.
Right.
So I haven't been to Kentucky since the beginning of all of COVID. I've been here in LA. So, but this was right before my last trip to Kentucky. We got to taste a little of that. And it's just like, I think you're absolutely right to note that everybody was doing it. It's just kind of like that tradition, and a lot of bourbon is that like. That's the way we've always done it kind of thing. But one of the things I think that's amazing right now about our team at the distillery is they're doing a lot of experimentation to kind of back up that, like, what we've always done works.
Right.
Like, we're working with the University of Kentucky right now to study wheat, right? We've got plots planted all over the state. We're partnering with them. We've got plots planted on our property, all to study not only wheat varietals and like starch content and things like that, but flavor that might come from like nitrogen in the soil. What are the cover crops used? What's the rainfall in that area? This, that, the other. I know terroir is not a term we like to throw on in whiskey because it doesn't necessarily translate all the way through distillation, maturation, all that. But as far as like what it does to the wheat, like itself, to the grain itself, we're studying that because we want to make sure that, like, hey, we've used the same wheat varietal from the same farmers forever. We're doing the work to back up that that's what makes our whiskey taste the way it does and taste best, what we think is best, right? Like, and so it's fascinating to see that. And our distillery team, the innovation team, the quality control team, so Jane Bowie, Denny Potter, that all those folks, they're doing amazing work to kind of, but all that work is led by this passion to like back up what we've always done, right? Like, we've done it because we've always done it that way, but now let's put our money where our mouth is and like back it up through science, and it's pretty fascinating to watch.
No, that's great. Hey, I'm gonna cap it at half an hour because I feel like that's like our audience's mass appetite limit for content. But this was great. Thank you so much for doing this with me and drinking, and cheers. And since you're in LA and I'm in LA, we should figure out a safe way to do this from 6 feet apart at some point soon.
Absolutely, definitely.
All right, we'll be in touch.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Phil. Cheers.